good afternoon, Sandra. I guess we've both been in the heart of storms. The bookstore got flooded last week because we had such terrible rain.
Oh my gosh. Well, we had thunderstorms last night that were kind of unexpected. And we had a power outage for 4 hours here where I am. And so it was nice to have rain though, at the first day of August or the last day of July, first day of August, I guess it was. So
Well,
how
it is
are
wonderful.
you?
We actually put a generator in. We decided that the heat
Yeah.
is so extreme here that we can't afford to lose our house, which we would do. But this all reminds me of one of the things I really enjoyed about your new book. So Sandra and I are here to talk about Blind Tiger, which is a really wonderful historical novel set in 1920 Texas. And I want you to know, Sandra, to prepare for this, I watched Once Upon a Time in the West last night, which is a wonderful movie made by Sergio Leone with this killer cast. Henry Fonda has the bluest eyes. I'd completely forgotten about that. Jason
Right.
Bogart and Claudia Cardinale of all people.
Oh,
Charles
wow.
Bronson. Great
Wow.
movie. But what it reminded me of in your book was just how uncomfortable people were and how dirty they were. You know, they didn't get to change their clothes. They didn't get to bathe very often. It was a real struggle. And I thought that your book, while it didn't dwell on that, it's just the background for it. But you
Yeah,
did a wonderful job of reminding us that 100 years ago, life was a lot more difficult.
I know. And it's funny too, because when I started doing my research, when I was looking into the cities, you know, like Chicago or New York, which is what people call to mind when they think about prohibition, you know, they think about the Al Capones and more in the Midwest and in the Northeast. But in Texas, you know, they didn't have that many automobiles yet. This is 1920. I mean, it's right, you know, at the beginning, at the onset of that decade. And so I had to find out how far the telephone lines went. Did they have long distance? How far the railroad went, because there was still this broad breast of Texas that didn't have the railroad. A lot of people that lived in the country still had outhouses, not indoor plumbing, although the town folk did. So it was it was really interesting to see how rustic some of it was, and of course it was still sort of the kind of the Wild West too. And I guess you might say that when I set out to write this book, it was how the Old West was meeting, you know, the onset of the modern era of the United States. And it really was a pivotal time in terms of all of these societal issues. The men coming home from an unpopular war, women after decades of struggle. The women's movement at that point in time was suffrage, and they were granted suffrage in January of that year, 1920, and January 16th of that year, nobody could buy a drink because prohibition went into effect. So it was very interesting doing the research, and once I got into it, I thought, gosh, this is what I'm going to write about. You know, the story just started emerging, and these characters just started emerging.
You know, it's funny because you're writing about Texas, and I grew up in north of Chicago in a very posh suburb called Winnetka. But right south of us, between Winnetka and Evanston, was the headquarters of the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union.
Right.
We're largely responsible for lobbying. Well, they certainly lobbied and were to a great degree responsible for prohibition. So, you know, it wasn't a rural movement. It was a large scale. It was a terrible decision. It was like the war on drugs, an equally,
Yes.
ridiculous decision. But there was, I think it might have been, Sandra, part of the reaction to the war, was that things had been so, I don't know what I want to say, but it was an attempt to restore order, I think, in a particular way. That was obviously not going to work, but nevertheless, people tried it, and I think women felt like they had some political power thanks to the suffrage, right, and that they could do a kind of moral legislation.
Well, one of the interesting things to me was that it was at the right time too that the suffrage became law, because when the men, and there were tens, hundreds of thousands of soldiers that went to World War I, and women filled the jobs that they left behind. So then when the war only lasted 18 months, but in that 18 months, women got a taste of what it was like not to do the ironing and the cooking and the child raising, and that was it. They got a taste of what it was like to work outside the home. So then when the men came back, it was a real societal shift that women were like, wait a minute, I have to go back into the traditional role, and I don't get to do the jobs anymore. So it created a real, as I say, a societal shift. That was seismic in terms of our society, our economy, everything. And then this was all going on at the same time that soldiers were they had post-traumatic stress. It was a loss of innocence for Americans in many ways, because these men had been exposed to European mores and rules of society that America had not. They were still very Puritan in many ways in their thinking. And so the men came back with new ideas. The women had taken their place in a lot of instances. And this is what I found interesting, because last year when I was stuck in lockdown, away from my family for 2 months, and I had to start thinking of a new book to write. And I thought, well, one thing I know I'm not going to write about is COVID-19. And I'm not going to write about all the other issues that were going on at that point in time. So I thought, what was going on 100 years ago? And when I look back, nothing was all that different. We still had the same issues, going on. They had a Me Too movement too, but it was just about suffrage. So all of these things, and that's what made the time period interesting to me, is to see really how relatable their problems were to our problems now. They haven't changed all that much.
No, they really haven't.
Big differences were being made.
Right. It reminds me of that old song, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris, which is one thing. And, we tend to think that Rosie the Riveter was, in fact, when in World War II, when it was over, that was that women had taken jobs and were now expected to give them back up again. That was the big thing. But it was also true in the First World War, where, as you say, women, there have been, Jacqueline Winspear writes about Maisie Dobbs, who broke away from the mold and became an ambulance driver in World War I, for example. So yeah, there's a great similarity. On the other hand, one of the things I really liked about the book is the relationship between, I'm trying to remember her name, I have to look up names.
Laurel.
Not Thatcher, Laurel, right?
You're right.
Right, there she is, Laurel. And her father-in-law, who has no idea she exists, she and the baby. And after the tragic events of their arrival, in which a death occurs in front of the outhouse, he quickly builds her another one so that she doesn't have to use, this already tragic location and all. But I thought to myself, he's an interesting character. He's so prickly and all, but yet how sensitive it was of him to think about, building a new outhouse for her. Of course, you also have to realize that if he was able to do it that fast, the standards for plumbing were pretty low.
Well, I did as you know, we've talked about this before. A lot of times, I only have a vague idea of what my characters are going to be like. I put them in their situation and write down what they say and what they do. I don't ever feel like I create them. I feel like they're already there, and they introduce themselves to me gradually as we go along. I loved Irv from the beginning for reasons like that. And and also in the development of Laurel's character. It was very important to me that she be a woman of her time, but a little ahead of the curve because of the tragic events that occurred back to back in her life. She resolved never to be dependent on anyone else again, and that she was going to have to make her own way. She couldn't rely on her parents, she couldn't rely on her husband. Um, she was left on her own. And she grasped that with relish, really, I think. So I wanted her to be very devoted to independence, but I also didn't want her to be brittle to the point that she was going to be unlikable. And so I couldn't have her and Thatcher, together right away, and their, you know, love affair had to develop over time. But I had to show her vulnerability and her kindness, and that she did have a soft heart. She put up this guarded front, but inside she was still very feminine in her reactions. So the way I demonstrated that was her, uh, she stood up to Irv, but her kindness to him and her gratitude to him, and to her relationship with Corinne. So there were ways in which I tried to demonstrate this is not a hard-hearted Hannah. She's not mean. She's brittle because she's guarded, but she still has this soft interior. So I kind of painted myself into a corner in that way during the writing. And I remember discussing it with my editor after he read the first few pages. I said, is she likable? Because I wanted her to be strong, but I didn't want her to be a basher in any way, shape, or form. So I liked that relationship that she and Irv developed because it allowed both of them to show soft sides of themselves.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, Irv, has had a hard life and is a crusty character, and he's suddenly confronted. Well, I don't think it's a spoiler to talk about because everything happens in the first chapter. And what Laurel is a young wife. Her husband went off to war. She has a baby called Pearl. And all of a sudden, well, it's your character, so you tell us, but her husband comes back from the war and he is not the man he was when he left.
He's damaged. Yeah. That was another issue that, wanted to address, was that this was right after World War I, and that soldiers were coming home with post-traumatic stress. And it was not called that, it was called shell shock.
Right.
But all of a sudden, as I've said, the women had their jobs. A lot of men were unemployed. So they were trying to deal with unemployment and this sense of having been replaced. Not only the traumas that they experienced in Europe, but they were jobless, they were homeless, couldn't support their families, they were out on the streets, and they were sleeping on the streets. They were our first real homeless problem in this country. Well, a lot of people, like the temperance union, which you mentioned, attributed that to alcohol. So let's get rid of the alcohol, and then all the other problems will go away. Well, we know that did not happen. All prohibition really did was intensify the problems, because then you had this giant crime wave,
Yeah.
which America had never seen before. So it was the prohibition of the sale and manufacture of alcohol was like a band-aid on these giant societal shifts, these giant societal problems. And that was the solution to many, when actually the alcoholism of some was only a symptom of the real issues that were
Well,
going
it's a bit
on.
like today's opioid crisis, where
Right.
we're very, very similar. But what I thought was interesting was the contrast that you draw between, in both characters, Laurel and Thatcher. Some people can survive difficult circumstances and terrible trauma, and other people are completely ruined by it. So Laurel's husband is a person who is ruined. He just can't recover from the war. Whereas Thatcher, who has also been in the war and been in similarly, terrible. I mean, World War I was such a personal war. I mean, people were in these awful trenches. They were, they were getting awful diseases. Their colleagues died around them. They had to stay there with rotting bodies and, the whole bit. It was much more personal than later, today combat by drone, but even in World War II, which was more mechanized and not trench warfare. So, it took a particular personality to survive that, in the same way that Laurel is a person who could have just crumbled, or a person
gone
who
back home, gone back to her parents,
or just given up. I often think of that in Dickens. I'm not a big Dickens reader because I can't read dialect because I read too fast, but so I know Dickens primarily by movies, but nonetheless, I always think about Oliver Twist and how some people, some personalities can do well under that kind of trauma and stress and, look for solutions and survive. And other people just either crumble or go bad or give up or whatever it might be. And I thought the contrast you drew between the three men, actually, it's among the three men, was really interesting because even Irv had some really difficult times in his life, and he'd chosen to withdraw. And, Laurel brings him back. Because he has to, there he is suddenly with this woman and a baby. And, he has to muster up some sort of enthusiasm or at least caretaking ability, like building her the outhouse. So I thought it was an interesting contrast in characters.
Well, there was even a scene, it was really a sequel where we're inside Laura's head, and she said she was afraid that if she didn't get up one more, she had grieved. If she didn't get up one morning, she was never going to get up. That she forced herself to move, to get over the inertia. And she makes up her mind, in a very definitive way, I've got to do this or I never will. She was afraid she'd just, lie there till she died. And so that was, I wanted to demonstrate what a strong character she was. And Thatcher, his whole thing is, okay, I went to war, I did my thing, I didn't like it. All I want to do is get home. He's Ulysses. All he wants to do is get home. And he doesn't make it. He gets waylaid. But what was so much, and I didn't know all of these characters were going to walk into the scenes as they did. The bootlegger, the madam, the Corinne, the prostitute, El Ray, all of these characters that showed up, I were like, gosh, I had so much fun writing this book because nearly every page was a revelation to me. I put the main characters in their situation, and even then I didn't know exactly what they were going to do and how it was going to turn out. And so it was so much fun for me because somebody would walk into a scene. For instance, Corinne, we had referred to the prostitute, that had gotten beat up, but I didn't even know her name at that point, and I just kept referring to her until she came up behind Thatcher and says, "Take me with you," and he's like, "Oh, yeah." And I thought, she's great. I had no idea she was going to show up. So it was really fun for me, to write. And I loved the time period. I really did. I loved the time period. It was
as you point out, anytime when society is fracturing and shifting and reassembling is a fascinating time. Tell me about Foley, Texas, because, that's this little tiny town where all this is going down. Is it a place you made up? Is it a place that you modeled on something? What is it?
it is definitely a place I modeled after a town about 50 miles from where I live in the Dallas Fort Worth area. It's about 50 miles southwest of Fort Worth, called Glen Rose. And little did I know, and I've lived in this area my whole life. Little did I know that Glen Rose was the moonshine capital of Texas. And I didn't know that until I started researching. When I decided I was going to write about prohibition, I started researching prohibition in Texas, and I came across this book called The Moonshine Raid of Glen Rose. And I went, what? Glen Rose? Because it's a quaint little town, darling little town, but who knew? And so I ordered the book from History Press. It's called, out of Charleston, South Carolina. And a gentleman who used to be a detective in Dallas for the police department had retired there. And he started researching this, and he wrote this book. So I got in touch with him. His name is Brown, but no relation that we know of. And I said, I've read your book and it's fascinating. And there was a big raid, and the Texas Rangers and local law enforcement got together, and it was in 1923. So I just started looking into all of this, and the research was fascinating. I would laugh out loud at some of the tales because you couldn't make this stuff up. You know, it was a lot of it was really comical. A lot of it was tragic. And so that it was the research on it was fascinating. So I didn't want to call it Glen Rose because there are still some relatives of some of these people that live there, descendants. So I thought, well, I'll call it Foley, and I didn't follow the true story of the raid and everything, but I took, you know, instances and characters and kind of patterned some of my characters after them.
So where is Thatcher actually trying to go? He gets stuck there in Foley because he gets off a boxcar. He's riding in a boxcar and he's worried about his safety. He's made a kind of a dumb move, really. And so he leaps out of the car into space, not knowing where he is or what will happen. And he's in Foley.
Well, Glen Rose is on the northern cusp of what we call the hill country. This is a little Texas geography that I had to even talk my editor through, because she says, well, Laurel leaves North Texas and goes to the hill country, but I thought the hill country was down around San Antonio, and he's going up to but in North Texas, the Panhandle. And I said, well, we don't call North Texas the Panhandle is the Panhandle. It's an area all its own. And North Texas is anything north of Dallas, Fort Worth, but it's on the eastern side of the state. And then you've got West Texas out to the way west. So it's kind of hard to describe to someone who's not from here that we have a little bit of everything. We have deserts and we have swamps, you know, and we have grasslands and we have prairie, and we have a coast. So it was a little bit confusing, but his ranch, the ranch that he had worked on and lived on, is in what we call the Panhandle, which is up near Colorado and just south of the Panhandle of Oklahoma, and near New Mexico. So it was different. And when he jumps off the train, he's still like I think I looked it up, still like 270 miles south of where he needs to be. Well, 275 miles at that point in time, where trains didn't go everywhere, he still had a long way to go to get home. So I wanted, it was as I say, I had to give a geography lesson, you know, to say, okay, look at the map. And when I'm talking about North Texas, I'm not talking about the Panhandle, I'm talking about another area.
Oh, I'm glad you cleared that up. We're doing an event with a first-time author called Taylor Moore, in a book called Downrange, which also takes place in this part of Texas. So I know the Panhandle because I've driven through it, because Interstate
Yeah.
40, if you're going from
Yeah,
Phoenix,
absolutely.
you cross the Panhandle and it sticks up there as
Right.
opposed to North Texas, which is
Yeah.
over here. And I mean, the diversity of Texas landscape, it's, California is like 3 or 4 different
Yeah, different.
countries and so forth, and Arizona for that matter. People think we're just desert, but in fact, we have mountains that are 14,000 feet high, up
Right.
in Flagstaff volcanoes, and pine forests and the whole bit. So,
Right.
all of our states are, not all of them, the western states are generally so large that they embrace more than
Right.
one landscape, as opposed to maybe Rhode Island or Vermont or, smaller, whatever it is. But I was just trying to orient people for purposes of the story. I also think it's fun that it was called Moonshine, because I tend to think that's an Appalachian term,
Of course.
but
Yeah.
apparently moonshine was the more universal term for homemade. Is it basically corn liquor?
It's
Is
corn
corn still the
liquor.
base for it?
It's corn liquor. And I included, Ernie's, the moonshiner. I included his recipe, which I found online. Of course, there are variations, and each moonshiner had his own technique, but it's generally made from mash made of unsprouted corn kernels and barley, water, sugar. And then they start a new batch with what they call poptail, which was after all the moisture was boiled, was cooked in the mash. That was what was left over. And it's like sourdough bread. They
Yeah.
start a new batch of mash with the poptail. So I haven't tried it at home.
Well, I have drunk it because I lived for part of my life in Appalachia, and it's really alcoholic. I mean, it has a
Very.
very high alcohol rate, so, and
Yeah.
it's clear.
And they
So,
don't,
it's
right.
pretty easy to get drunk, to overdo moonshine.
Unlike like bourbon whiskeys that they soak in casks after they make it, moonshine was drunk almost right out of the
Right.
tap, and it was called white lightning because it didn't have the amber color that bourbon gets from the casks. And so I have yet to try it, but I'm going to a book club party where they're going to serve moonshine cocktails.
Well, just
I'll
have a
let you know.
tiny, tiny little bit. I can tell
I'll
you that
let you
aging
know.
does not improve it.
I think,
I mean, it
yeah.
doesn't need to spend any time in a cask, because it just does not. I really enjoyed this, Sandra. You've indicated that you were fascinated by the period, and you've written a huge number of books. So, it was fun to take a break and write something
It
historical
was.
as compared to other things.
It was so much fun. And this was actually the fifth historical
Right.
of my career. The last one was Rainwater, which was written in, I think it was published in 2008. So it had been 13 years. Is that right? But I really did enjoy the change of pace. I enjoyed the research on this. I had a lot of research to do, had to learn how to make moonshine, had to learn how to drive a Model T. So there were a lot of things that were really fun about the research on this book. And it was just I think last year we were all, just so inundated with bad news all the time, daily. And because we were at home, we were watching more news. And it was like getting through a newscast was like taking a beating. It was just like, how much more, can we absorb? And I think I was ready for escapism. And I figured that if I was, that a lot of people would be. I think a lot of readers were like, gosh, got to get away from this. So I'm not alone in trying something different this year. And I think it
No,
was
not at
all
all. And we certainly have noticed at the store, we've noticed a lot of a big uptick in classics, the sale of, classics, a sale of the kind of books that, like War and Peace that you wouldn't normally feel that you had
right.
time to read. And certainly a lot of historical fiction. I've always loved historical fiction, so
I
I
do
spent
too.
much of my life reading it. So for me, it wasn't anything different. And I don't read it for escapism so much as that I'm fascinated with learning things. I mean, tragically, we seldom learn from history,
Right.
as we are doomed to repeat the same mistakes. And you're right that things that are true in your book are also true today. Not stuff like sanitation, not stuff about the really primitive state of
But
medicine.
the
I mean,
society
when
and
Pearl the baby is sick, there's it just that there's not a lot that medicine is going to be able to do. Certainly, there wasn't a lot of mental health operations, or sorry, mental health support that's available, but in many parameters of life, it's very similar. Let me end by asking you, why is it called blind tiger? Because that's kind of fun.
when I first started doing research on prohibition, I came across that term and I thought, what is that? And it said another term for speakeasy. I'd never heard it before, but I thought, gosh, that's going to be a great title because I love the alliteration. I love that it had the same number of letters. And I thought it would be more intriguing, than just speakeasy. And I actually looked it up. The origin of the word was English. They started calling businesses that did a storefront business, but in the back, it was a blind tiger, which was the illegal making of alcohol and selling it. And so, and it originated in the 1850s in England. But I thought it was going to make a great title, and I think it does. I think it looks great on the cover.
And you do. And we forgot to mention that the reason we're talking about prohibition and moonshine and all is that this is how Laurel decides that she's going to pull herself up by her bootstraps in Foley, Texas. So she gets involved in moonshining, which is, was lucrative. In fact, what prohibition actually did was foster the rise of organized crime. I mean, I am, as I mentioned earlier, from Chicago, and you
Yeah.
know that people like Capone and so forth took advantage, not just Chicago, but back east, New Jersey in particular, and so forth. And here in Phoenix, there was a lot of organized crime because of the illegal profits that could be made, the spectacular profits that could be made off prohibition. We also forget that, people made stuff like bathtub gin, and some people went blind from drinking it. You didn't have any control over, the
Yeah.
quality of it. Nobody was inspecting it. So, there were a lot of people who, in pursuit of whatever, and drank the wrong kind of moonshine, suffered some major health losses. And the same way that people have abused opioids or other things. It's just interesting that, people want to resort to some artificial means of escapism. I'd rather they read books, but
Me
but
too.
it doesn't work that way for everybody. And pain is a hard thing to live with. And especially, before, I mean, I think aspirin was only invented in something like 1923, but there were actually very few analgesics that were available for people
Yeah.
a century ago.
Well,
And
they say they drank. In fact, Irv even says, his bum hip, he called it,
yeah.
and he said, I take a nip of shine every now and then for medicinal purposes.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. My
Yeah.
father, towards the end of his life, I mean, he loved to drink. He wasn't an alcoholic. He just like, and he was a very sweet drunk when he was drunk, which was hardly ever, but he just liked drinking. And I remember, talking to his doctor and saying, don't you think maybe we ought to say something to Daddy? And he said, no, he said, most of these old guys, they drink, to self-medicate. They don't feel that well. And alcohol is probably not as bad for them as, various other drugs. And, some people can drink and not become addicted to it.
Oh,
Other people,
absolutely,
unfortunately,
yeah.
I mean, we all have different body chemistry. And
Right.
that plays a big role, a big role in it too. But for centuries, alcohol was really the only anesthetic or the only way to sort of self-medicate.
Well, and in fairness to the book, I'm not, an advocate of over drinking, because I even portray a character in the book who tragically, is alcoholic and suffers. Her whole family, suffers the consequences of it. So I wanted to show, it one drink might not hurt somebody, but it could also be very damaging to somebody that is very susceptible to it. So
Yep, unfortunately true. It's a lot of it's genetics, and there's so many different explanations for it. But the point is, we can't really legislate all of this stuff.
that's right. You can't legislate morality,
No,
and
it's very
people.
difficult.
And
So
it's
anyway,
sad
it's a
to-
wonderful book, Blind Tiger. I want to encourage you to I forgot to mention, that we've actually sent Sandra copies of this book to autograph. Thank you
I've
very
signed
much. They
them. Yep.
probably shipped to you today. So we won't have them for just a little while, but it's such a wonderful book. We thought that Sandra Brown fans would enjoy having autographed copies. And as Sandra's been to visit us recently several times, we wanted to kind of keep the momentum going. So Sandra, thank you for spending a little time with me
Thank you,
today.
Barbara, for having me. It's always such a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, and to you too. So we'll look forward to getting together in person next year, I think.
Right. I'll look forward to that.
Okay, me too.
Thanks
Thanks
so
very
much.
much. Bye.